This is Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. On the show, you'll meet the doers, the Australian clinicians, care workers and healthcare professionals driving the micro-changes we seek to showcase. Theirs are the stories we're here to tell. I'm your host, Will Egan, and I'm the CEO of AusMed Education. I'm really passionate about improving the health and prosperity of the people in my community. I believe Australia does have a great health system, and every conversation we have on this show highlights why. Today, I'm joined by Tony McGillion. Tony is the Divisional Director of Education at Northern Health. Northern Health is one of Victoria's largest public health services. They have over 8,000 staff and see a whopping 110,000 presentations in their emergency department each year. In this episode, Tony details the structure and strategic plans of their new education and training division. I found this conversation very insightful because of the extremely diverse learning cohorts Tony and his team need to support. Tony shares how his approach, which is focused on interprofessional practices, improved education models, and utilising AI and innovative technologies, plans to meet these varied learning needs. It's going to be a fascinating discussion, so let's jump in. Tony, it's great to have you on the show. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Will, and it's fantastic to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Tell us about your career thus far and what you're working on at the moment.
Currently, I'm Divisional Director of Education and Training at Northern Health, and the role encompasses the amalgamation of education across nursing, midwifery, medicine, allied health, and digital learning under one umbrella, one governance structure, as a new division across Northern Health, which appreciates, the importance of education and training to the success of the whole organisation and the outcomes it's trying to achieve. Prior to this role, I was at Western Health as Director of Nursing and Midwifery with the portfolio of Inspiring Innovation, which was a tough gig during the worst of the pandemic, actually, I have to say, because innovation wasn't necessarily uppermost in people's minds. It tended to be more about survival of the fittest, really, and even the unfittest. They were surviving too and doing a fantastic job. So a lot of my work at Western Health was focused on involving the health assistant workforce, which is in Victoria, the RUSON workforce, otherwise known as the Registered Undergraduate Student of Nursing. And in addition to that, running leadership development programs for our middle and senior managers and leaders and helping them to manage their team's wellness, fatigue and potential burnout issues as well. So I guess my brief changed a few times according to the depths of the pandemic at the time, but it was an incredibly interesting role and it was hard to leave, to be honest. So the lure of this current role was significant. Prior to Western Health, I was at La Trobe Uni for, 4.5 years as Associate Professor of Nursing, and I was involved in our overseas Singapore transition program where we transitioned diploma qualified nurses to bachelor, which was fantastic. And I was also Director of Partnerships. So it gave me a good insight into the organisation's needs and getting the universities to work more closely with industry, which I think I was quite good at doing because I'd previously worked in industry. So I had a good connection with some of the people, and it really brought home to me the importance of people in making things work as opposed to infrastructure alone.
And by infrastructure, do you mean physical infrastructure or do you also include in that technology?
A bit of both, actually. And technology is an interesting point to raise there because at La Trobe, we were given 1 week to turn all our teaching into online products during the Delta wave of the pandemic. So we were, forced into thinking outside the square, which has been fantastic for many of us, particularly people my age who perhaps hadn't embraced technology fully, but when forced to do so, have really sort of gone along that journey and embraced it. And I have to say, most of what I know with technology now, I was taught by many of my students.
During that period or just over the journey?
During that period, because they'd been using technology in their own way for a long time, and even something as simple as Zoom, which we take for granted now, or Teams, was a scary proposition for many of us in terms of how do we teach nursing and midwifery, which is a very practical and vocational set of skills. How do we teach that online? And not just how do we do that, but how do we do it well?
You're also the chair of the Vic region, which my understanding is a voluntary position for the Australian College of Nursing. I know I've personally seen you at a few events. Tell us a little bit about your role and your work there.
So I've volunteered with the Australian College of Nursing for a number of years now, and 2 years ago was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to be the chair for the Melbourne region and for Victoria as well. And that's really enabled me to lead a small leadership team in Victoria, but also connect with our members across the state as well. And in doing that, support their needs and lobby on their behalf on several occasions. In terms of supporting them, well, it's really more about connections and networks, but also holding webinars and seminars for them and with them. And my work at the college also involves a significant amount of mentoring. And that mentoring is through a number of different avenues, but includes the Emerging Nurse Leader program at the college. I'm a strong supporter of identification of emerging leaders and not putting them off. So keeping them on track and supporting that journey for them. But also there's a mid-career leadership program at the college that I both teach into, but I also mentor some of their participants too in terms of people who might be interested in different types of journeys in their professional careers and how I can actually help them to achieve that and achieve their potential.
Fantastic. Thank you for that outline of your, as we said earlier, storied career. And I think it's certainly going to add to the quality of the conversation that we have today around the role of an education department or education itself in driving outcomes.
Could I just add one thing, Will, that I probably should have said? Before I was at La Trobe, I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services, as they were known at that time, as a senior...
That's in Victoria?
Victoria, yes, yeah. And I had two roles. I was the Senior Policy Advisor for Nursing Education and Training, and I also managed their nursing and midwifery workforce team. So I sort of combined those two roles at the same time and provided advice to state government around key areas of education and training, such as graduate programs in Victoria and also attraction from overseas of nurses, migrant nurses to work in the state, but also supporting the training and development grant program, which was significant and still is significant in Victoria to support education and training at undergraduate, postgraduate levels. Yeah.
I'd love to hear your perspective as an educator on what we mean when we talk about healthcare outcomes.
For many years, I've worked really hard to connect the work of education and training to outcomes of healthcare in general. And I do remember I worked somewhere a few years ago where there wasn't necessarily a finite connection between some of the work that we did and some of the work that was needed.
What do you mean by that?
Well, sometimes education and training could go in a direction that doesn't necessarily benefit the needs of the population of the workforce or the community at that time. And a good example is the national standards that came into effect a few years ago pretty much anointed some key areas of patient outcomes that organisations needed not just to meet, but to exceed, to remain accredited to perform that service. So that was a great opportunity to tie in and better connect education and training activities to the needs of that population and those organisations, rather than recycle and keep redoing education and training type programs that historically were what was needed. So the national standards gave us a real good opportunity. And I went so far as to say at that time, we should only be really doing things where we can actually use one of those national standards icons with the education and training that we do, so that we can always connect what we're doing with what the system needs ultimately.
So in that example and throughout the show, we're talking to people across different sectors: aged care, disability support. Early September 2023, we saw a communication from the Safety and Quality Agency that project is commencing to look into establishing a set of standards for paramedicine in Australia, which is exciting. Our observation is that the quality and veracity of the regulation and the quality regulation itself in Australia is one of the drivers, one of the things that drives better health outcomes nationally. So in your experience working in large public hospitals in an acute setting where you're regulated by the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare, and I believe the standards you're referring to are the NSQHS standards, and then there's linked quality indicators to those standards. So I'd love to hear more about what life was like before you tied training and education to the outcomes, the quality indicators, and then after that, what did that change entail and what did it look like?
I guess before the national standards came into effect, we were governed more by an accreditation system that was a lot more abstract and a lot less clinical. And it didn't necessarily provide the sort of guidance for what we did within education and training contexts as well as the national standards did. And I don't see the national standards as an accreditation tool. Specifically, I see them as fantastic guidance for all organisations to know what to aim for. And we're not silly. We don't think we're going to wake up tomorrow and work somewhere that has had 0 patient falls in the last 6 months or 0 hospital-acquired infections. But we do know that through that cycle of audit and doing PDSAs around improvement, we do know that we're going to eventually erode and reduce incidences of complications and improve quality of life as an outcome for the people we care for. So it gives us a lot of confidence that what organisations are accredited to do is just the minimum requirement. We know that we've got something bigger than that to aim for. And I liken that pretty much to the road toll. And I said to someone the other day that I think patient falls is very similar to the road toll in that we should be aiming for 0 falls, just like we should be aiming for 0 deaths on our roads in Australia. And the person said, well, that's impossible. We need to gradually get to 0. We can't or never get there. And I said, well, unless we aim for 0, we're never going to get to 0, are we? It's like the road toll. Look, if we aim for 50 deaths on our roads instead of 200, that's not great for those 50 people and those 50 families affected. So surely aiming for 0, even though it's not realistic to get there overnight, gives us all that vision and something to aim for.
Absolutely. And for something that can be 0, especially in the case of falls, it gives a vision and possibly also a pragmatic hope towards trying to achieve that. So when we think about, and I'm going to kind of try and lean on some of your academic experience here, when we think about educational evaluation, a lot of education that we see and also sometimes that we're delivering here at AusMed isn't evaluated perhaps using the most sophisticated or ideal methodology. Even though it's an old model, we talk about the Kirkpatrick model of educational evaluation. I'm sure you're familiar with that. But for listeners that might not be, Don Kirkpatrick, an academic, it must be at least 40 or 50 years ago now, outlined a model to evaluate the effectiveness of learning using 4 levels. Level 1 being reaction. Did somebody enjoy it? I always say, was the air conditioning nice? Because when we used to run events, that would be the main feedback: air conditioning and catering, good or bad. Level 2, learning. Did learning take place? Did they engage with that? Did they feel that there was a value to the knowledge being communicated overall? Level 3, behaviour. Does the learner intend to change behaviour, or have they been able to identify any behaviour changes that they could make in their practice? But then ultimately level 4, results, that the training led to a change in the outcome. So education that we're doing on falls, we can actually draw a straight line and show how there's been a reduction in the rate of falls or any other quality indicator as a result. Our observation is that a lot of learning is evaluated at that level 2, including things like Likert scales to ask, participants whether they gained any new knowledge from the education. But we don't see a lot at that level 3 or level 4. When we look at it across the system as a whole, so not just the acute care sector or the sector that's following the NSQHS standards, but when we look at auditing and accreditation requirements in, say, aged care or disability care, our view, or our observation at least, is that the idea of evaluating education at that level 2 is reinforced by asking providers, accredited organisations, to provide evidence of participation. What percentage of your staff has done the force training? So I guess my question to you is, firstly, do you share those views or do you have a different experience? And secondly, where is a typical large public hospital at with this educational evaluation at the moment?
Look, I might just start by saying that the Patrick model is a seminal model that is, I guess, similar to Benner's novice to expert seminal work across the board. And in many ways, it does dominate people's thinking still in education, learning, training, practice. And the evaluation of what we do probably hasn't really developed in a way or evolved in a way that it might. We used to have a system of accreditation that was largely built on compliance. And I think the historical way of saying education's been successful because 30 people attended and 30 people were still there and are still awake at the end, I think we've gone past that, but we haven't completely left that behind, I don't think. Like, I still hear people talking about, well, if I ask them, how's that going? How was it evaluated? It's largely around who was still in the program at the end of the 12 months. Did they enjoy their rotations? But to me, the critical part of the evaluation is, what are they contributing to the outcomes of the organisation? And are they going to stay working here? Can we retain them? So yes, it's bigger than, we used to call it bums on seats. And I guess sometimes we still do, don't we? But yeah, we've evolved, but we haven't perhaps evolved in a way that we might. One of the things I'd like to see more of is that in our practice of delivering education and training, we're translating evidence into practice and using evidence such as recent, up-to-date, contemporary, real-life clinical risk and incidents. We're incorporating that into case studies to inform how we teach and what we teach. And God forbid we use more contemporary ways of delivering and sharing knowledge and skills with others, which isn't necessarily only the chalk and talk or the whiteboard, face-to-face stuff that we've done historically. And, we've successfully transitioned to hybrid models of education now because we were forced to, but I think we can go.
And they've sustained after the pandemic, that's become, in a sense, the new normal?
In many ways, yes. Like, for example, I'm becoming an accredited Speaking Up for Safety trainer at Northern Health, which means I went to the Cognitive Institute to do their trainer program. And they're really pushing for face-to-face training for safety. Yet organisations are still a little bit nervous about the face-to-face stuff because of the risk of wiping out whole populations of healthcare workers all at once. And not just through COVID, but through influenza or common cold. But I think we could embrace artificial intelligence moving into the future a little bit more and find ways of using apps, using real-time communication via mobile devices and iPads, and maybe even avatars as a way of, if every learner had their own avatar that we could communicate with them through, reminding them how to do things and when to do things. I think there's great things that we can do in the future, and AI is just becoming probably the most talked about subject in existence at the moment, but often in a negative way, unfortunately.
Put quite a few interesting things out just then for me to kind of get more information on and ask you more things about. But I think before I get to those, I just really want to verify or validate, is it the case now, or is it your view that we should be moving away from those completion rate-based, sentiment-based evaluations of education and much more towards the type of model that you just outlined earlier, which is looking at what is a definition of a high-performing education department. It's one that contributes to a reduction in falls or a reduction in hospital-acquired infections, whatever it may be. Is that what's happening in large hospitals, or is progress being made there? Is that how it's running now?
Progress is definitely being made, and it's about the conversations that people with education interest have with each other and with people who perhaps don't get what education and training really is and what it does to support the organisation. I mean, my current employer, Northern Health, by creating this division, do appreciate the importance. So I feel very confident and comfortable to give my views about how we can measure outcomes better. We do focus a lot on mandatory training, like many organisations do. And in many cases, often it's an annual compliance measure to meet preset compliance rates. So an example of that is, this is not being critical of the process, but basic life support is a really good example of a clinical skill that historically, at least once a year, nearly every clinical health professional that works in acute or even sub-acute or aged care has been required to complete an assessment to deem them as competent. Now, and I've challenged this to some extent. Firstly, I don't think anyone could be competent in something that they only do once a year on a mannequin. Competency is far more than that. But secondly, because we've got such fantastic early warning systems, MET calls, clinical reviews, so many people involved in keeping patients safe, the chances of finding people in a situation where you need to do basic life support is vastly reduced compared to 5 to 10 years ago. But we're still spending hours and thousands of dollars rendering people competent in a skill set that they're not likely to need. And we're calling it mandatory, which means that if they don't do it, there is potentially a consequence for not doing it. But we don't make mandatory, and we don't spend enough time doing falls prevention education when we know that that is something we do need to focus on because it happens all the time. And we know it's one of those wicked problems that are difficult to fix. So it's turning around the compliance in something we're less likely to need. I'm not saying we're never going to need basic life support, because we are, but basic life support practice rather than assessment might be the goal. But using that time that we save and spending it doing things we're more likely to need to keep patients safe. I went to a falls management consortia meeting a couple of weeks ago where some very clever people from across Victoria were scratching their heads about how we can stop this happening, but we're not making great inroads into that because we've got an aging population. So we've got a larger number of people who are likely to fall than we've ever had before. We know that's going to get bigger and bigger. So we need to do things differently. And so I guess it's a cliche, but what got us here won't get us there.
I think that's a good example. And let me ask this as a question. Does your education division get allocated a fixed number of hours or time that you can spend with the average clinical professional, so the average employee? Is that how education is allotted? It's a budgeted time window?
Yeah, it's a little bit different across the different disciplines, but we have X amount of EFT of educators that work across nursing, midwifery, medicine, and allied health. Their role is to support those healthcare professionals to keep their patient cohorts safe. And that might mean we spend 80% of our time perhaps with 20% of the workforce, and that 20% might be the undergraduates and the graduates, whereas the rest of the workforce, the other 80%, probably don't get as much education input and time because we're spending all our time on the 20%. And we're doing it for valid reasons, because they're the population who need the knowledge, experience, and skills from us.
Which goes back to Benner's novice to expert, repeated exposure to variable situations as quickly as possible to help somebody get up that experience.
And once they become experts, we don't necessarily invest as much time in them because they've reached their expert level.
And that's when it just defers down to a continuous mandatory training kind of regime, and supplemented with quality initiatives, it's fair to say, and then transformation initiatives, if we were to call them that, rolling out a new EMR or a new device.
That's quite typical, Will. But there's self-identification of needs too. Like a nurse with 25 years experience might move from one specialty to another and still need initial extra resources to help them to become confident and competent in new skill sets, even though they're experienced professionals. And new people from different organisations are starting all the time. So education input is always needed, but it's often needed in the clinical setting at that point of contact with patients, consumers and clients. And that's where it becomes not more difficult, but that one-to-one education real time is very different to putting a whole bunch of people into a room and giving them all the same education and training at the same time. So particularly in our formal professional pathways, a lot of stuff happens one-on-one and in corridors and informally. Incidental is a good word, actually, which you don't necessarily capture that in any formal pathway or funding strategy. Because I should mention that too, is we do spend a lot of time providing education and training for staff who have coming through funded pathways, government-funded pathways, such as our students, postgraduate students as well, and graduates as well.
That makes sense. So this is probably a good time to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the unique role. It seems like quite a unique role that Northern Health has engaged you for. Is it a unique role, and what's the goal that you're trying to achieve there?
It's unique for Northern Health, but it's not a unique governance structure by any means. I'd worked at Austin Health about 10 years ago where they had a similar structure where they moved to having a governance structure where all the professional disciplines were put under one umbrella. And the reason for doing that was around the concept of interprofessional practice. No one has any hesitation of working together as a team to best care for patients and consumers, but the concept of learning together was not necessarily formalised until the Austin model in Victoria. The Karolinska Institute in Sweden have been doing this for some time. They had interprofessional wards, and a lot of the earlier work at the Austin was built on the evidence from Sweden. But Northern Health, they recognised that so much fantastic work was going on in the different disciplines in different ways, but wouldn't it be nice to try and have a common governance structure that got people to work together a little bit better, and in doing so, gain some efficiencies in governance and hopefully outcomes as well, better outcomes, but also getting people more comfortable that they're learning with other disciplines so that when it comes to working in practice with other disciplines, there's a much better, more mutual understanding of the work and the contributions that different disciplines do to patient outcomes. So it's like putting the patient in the middle of a model and putting the education and training around circling the patient or the consumer, but not necessarily saying doctors do this, nurses do that. It's saying this is the healthcare team, this is what the team will do, rather than picking out different parts, different chunks of it.
Or training people in isolation from one another. In fact, when you arrive at that person's bedside or in their home or wherever it may be, there's multiple people supporting that person who you need to be aware of their roles, and obviously whether you're helping them or maybe being an inconvenience through your own practice. So is that the definition of interprofessional education from your perspective? We're learning together as a healthcare team about how to support a client patient through that care event?
Absolutely. And it's more than just putting a whole bunch of people from different disciplines in a room together and providing a lecture on some anatomy and physiology. So it's more than that. It's the teamwork qualities and the mutual understanding of what people can and can't do and the appreciation of what people do. So otherwise it's quite inefficient. And a good example would be any given time at the start of every year, we could have 100 interns in one room, 100 nursing graduates in another, and 100 new physios in another room, and they could all be receiving the same information from different people at the same time. It seems like a fantastic idea is to put them all together and share that information with everyone at the same time, because they're going to be working together, and that's a fantastic way of them getting to know each other as well. And even in our governance structure here, I'm very lucky, I've got 4 directors of each discipline that report to me, and they're experts in their own professional areas. But having me as someone that they report to enables me to provide leadership to them at that really, really high level. and give them the confidence for them to work together and get to know each other in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have done before too.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your strategic plan.
This was a plan that was developed before I was recruited into this role. So our Director of Allied Health Education was taken offline last year to produce this plan that was based on focus groups, interviews and surveys with a large number of stakeholders internally and externally. And so the plan is just a bunch of words on a page, but they're really good words and very sage, and they're words that belong to everyone, not just belong to me or to him or to anyone else. So my role when I came on board was to launch the words and to launch our division, but then to bring to life the words in the plan. Otherwise, they're just going to be like every other mission statement or every other 5-year plan that people don't necessarily understand or care about.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the plan. I'm sitting on the edge of my chair to hear about the words themselves. I think you'll offer a unique perspective based on your background and the fact that this is a recent thing. It's a post-pandemic plan. A lot of providers across the country in all the different sectors, in our experience, at the start of reevaluating this and moving from that reactive stance to a proactive stance. Okay, in this new normal world, with a workforce that's in stress, the healthcare workforce is growing at 5.4% a year, or at least the number of jobs are, which is 2.5 times the rate of growth of the population. So if anyone's thinking, as we know, we're all experiencing a scarcity of employees, it's because the growth of health across the country is so high. But in the face of that, education and training strategies are being reviewed. So I think you'd have one of the newer ones in the country. Love to hear what it actually is seeking to achieve.
Obviously, this is a plan, as you say, put together still during the pandemic, but not through the worst of it. So people had a little bit more mental and physical space to give it the thought that was required. But it also fits as it needed to. It sort of nestles into the Northern Health wider set of strategies and values as well. And the Northern Health values are very simple and unpretentious, which is safe, kind, and together, which are 3 very simple words, but have 3 very simple, very sort of wide-spreading consequences. The word safe on its own pretty much sums up what all of us are here to be. Kind is what you would think every person who works in healthcare would be. And together is really that focus on collaboration. So we put together our strategic plan with that safe, kind, together in mind. And we've basically divided it into 6 different priorities. First one being collaboration. Now, it seems a bit glib to talk about collaboration, and you'd see it written in any plan for anything, wouldn't you? So why is it especially important for education and training? Well, it's about our internal and external stakeholders. So the plan was put together by a number of stakeholders, including our university partners, our TAFE partners, our government partners, and our learners and our seasoned professionals that work at Northern Health. And one thing that has enabled me to be potentially successful in this role is I've worked in academia, so I know how important academic partners are to Northern Health, but I also know how important Northern Health is to our academic partners. So that brings to life collaboration. So to me, they're not just words. It's not even a concept, it's a real thing. It's something that we do every day without even realizing. Our second priority is around our education model. We talk about our model being inclusive, responsive, and innovative. So by inclusive, we're taking into account that where Northern Health is and the growth corridor that we're in, we're serving a community that's very multicultural and is growing exponentially. So we have a workforce that in some way sort of mirrors the population that we look after. So it being inclusive, being responsive, so having the ability to cater for needs that come up tomorrow, as opposed to, sorry, I know that's a problem, but this is our fixed education curriculum for the next 3 years, so you need to wait. And innovative. I don't know any situation where patients have ever been injured by an education and training model. So I think we can be safe in what we do in saying there's really no limitations to what we can be innovative with in the way that we teach and encourage other people to learn under our governance.
That's an interesting framing of that, especially where I imagine some of those stakeholders that you refer to are the quality team or an accreditation team, or who are, as it is their role, incredibly mindful of risk and managing that risk, exposing the organisation to risk. But it is the case in terms of the delivery of education, the models themselves, and maybe now is a good time to bring the AI conversation back to the fold. But if we're measuring completion rates, then the effectiveness of the training itself is almost not a KPI. But if you move the organisation forward and you say, well, how is the educational model and driving the organisation's clinical outcomes and care outcomes, then you start to look at the effectiveness of the delivery itself. And when you double click on that, you realize there's not much risk in the mode of learning as long as the outcomes are achieved, which indirectly means the person benefited from the training. They were obviously there and were able to identify ways to improve their practice. So that's a good thing, because I think in a sector like aged care, just to draw a contrast to that, there's been hundreds of changes in the regulatory framework in aged care as part of the reform agenda of the past few years, and still more to come. And that has a risk, I suppose, of flowing down into the education team, and almost they risk becoming an engine room of compliance, which is, we have this new regulatory requirement, you need to teach everybody how to do it 100 times over in 2 years. So you move into that compliance mindset, which takes you back to the completion rates. Whereas I think what you're contending is that if you focus on those outcomes and you think from a first principle standpoint, what does the educational model need to look like? I love that that the first principle is sitting around the consumer, which is one of the principles, being inclusive, but then having that flexibility around delivery. So tell us a little bit about the type of innovation that you're doing or that you hope to do. What's on the radar?
Yes, well, and obviously I'm learning myself about what is possible when it comes to artificial intelligence and how that can help us in what we do every day. But we're already using Padlet, which is a really good educational tool. We're using that in some of our allied health education practices in particular. It's a way of people being able to make comments anonymously if they want to during sessions, ask questions. It's a way of people answering questions that the presenter might be asking during sessions, particularly delivered online. It's a way of communicating with the presenter and making that learning a two-way process rather than just a one-way deliverance of information. Padlet is probably 10 to 15 years old and will eventually be overtaken by stuff that's being developed now. One of the best things I ever went to was a futures workshop a few years ago where we were told to remove our blinkers, imagine how we could solve the nursing workforce issues of the present and the future. And none of us could do it. So none of us could take off the blinkers.
What are the blinkers in practical terms? What did you keep seeing that the blinkers were trying to hide from view?
What we were seeing is what historically we've experienced and what we know. So thinking 25, 30 years ahead is very hard for us because everything we know now has come about through many years of experience and assimilation of knowledge. And by taking off the blinkers, that has been so hard for many of us because it's almost impossible to know what's achievable in the future when everything you know now is built on what you've done in the past. In that session, that futures workshop I went to, we started talking about robotics and how we could be using robotics to help us with our workforce shortages, which was very controversial at the time. But robotics aren't new anymore, as you would appreciate. And perhaps healthcare haven't used robotics or assimilated it in a way that other industries have successfully over time. When I worked at La Trobe, I used to go to Singapore a fair bit to teach, and the hotel I stayed in every time had some robots, and the robots used to roam around delivering different linen to rooms, taking it away, communicating by saying good morning. We know that in aged care we've had loneliness robots that have been companions to residents for quite a long time now, and potentially we could do more in that space in terms of falls prevention. And I talked about this with a group the other day. We know that a lot of patients have urgent needs to go to the toilet, get out of bed, slip, and fracture their hips. What if there was a little robot at the end of their bed who could detect when they were trying to get up, who could then say, Mr. Smith, please ring your call bell and get some help. Don't get up on your own. So using robots for good instead of thinking they're going to take over the world, which a lot of people, because I was accused in that workshop of eroding the nursing workforce by replacing them with robots. And I said, that's not exactly what I'm saying. We know we're going to have a shortage. How can we use robots as a positive, not a replacement? So an additional resource, not a replacement resource.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a conversation that comes up many, many times over in the years ahead. I think there's some really great theory around how workforces change over time. If we go back, say, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have an AIN PCA workforce. We had nursing going into universities in the mid-80s here in Australia, and very quickly followed by a Div 2 in Victoria, or an enrolled nurse. And today there's 440,000 nurses on the NMBA, the Nursing Midwifery Board of Australia's register, but it's estimated that there's 640,000 people working as care or support workers in the disability care sector and the aged care sector. So these are the things I'm reminded as you talk about innovation, that not a lot changes day to day, but boy, can a lot change over a decade. And there's a really famous picture of New York, I think it must have been early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. There's one car on the road and everything else is a horse. Fast forward 10 years, there's one horse on the road and everything else is a car. And that's the type of change I suspect we're about to endure with the revelation of large language models and AI and embedded advanced chips, such as into robots, such as the example you gave of potentially an AI robot at the end of someone's bed. It seems that culture and leadership is perhaps a limiting factor here. So what would you say is the importance of that? How does the executives, the people at the top, which in healthcare are typically much older, what do they need to be thinking or doing or supporting their workforce and their organisations to do in order to create a fertile ground from a cultural and leadership standpoint for these ideas to flourish, or for changes such as your new educational model?
Look, I think do things like they have already done at Northern Health by supporting the setting up of a new education and training division in the face of significant budgetary constraints in this post-COVID time, where most organisations in public health anyway constrained financially. So it's a real statement of support for education to say, okay, we know things are a bit tight, but this is really important. So that gives us all the confidence to know that we have significant value. We have a duty then to translate that into providing the right advice to exec and to boards about where they should be spending their money in the future and how they should be spending it and what we feel is important. Because I'm here talking about the importance of innovation. I'm sure there's hundreds of people, there's probably thousands across Victoria of people who think innovation is a fantastic thing. We just need the airtime for those ideas. Because if I look back 15 to 20 years to what healthcare was like, there's been significant changes that we never would have thought would have happened unless people with innovative ideas hadn't continued to push them. And a good example of that, Will, I think, is enrolled nurses giving medications. Like 20 years ago, I could have mentioned it and you would have thought, oh, that's never going to happen in my professional lifetime. But of course, it's just commonplace now. And now we're talking about extending our registered nurse scope in terms of prescribing outside of the nurse practitioner group, which I think is fantastic. And getting people to work to their full scope is really, doesn't sound innovative, but we should be doing it.
I think to relate that back to your comment earlier about the robot replacing someone's job, that's looking down the line. That's a relatively menial task. And robots aren't going to be working out who to prescribe medication to, and they may be able to support a clinical decision or a prescribing decision around contraindications or something like that. But as a workforce, all of the theory shows, I'm thinking about people like Michael Porter and Clayton Christensen, that say that we need to be looking kind of up the line, up market. There's a constraint above the role of nursing. There's not so much a constraint below that can't be filled through a role of a support worker or Cert 3 in individual support, but there's a lot of scarcity further into the more advanced areas of practice that you go, there's constraints there. So my view, for what it's worth, is let the robots do all of the menial tasks eventually and free people up to do that intellectual work, which is also higher value and leads to higher rates of pay, which is critical for the system to figure out how to achieve in order for that workforce sustainability over the long term.
Yeah. And look, I will say also, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but sometimes what we might think are menial tasks might be the most important components of that interface between healthcare professionals and patients and consumers. And, a good example might be nurses are so busy, patients may not get the attention they need in terms of getting their teeth cleaned regularly. The reason I'm saying this is the Francis report from the UK a few years ago was very critical. Now, this was an NHS trust that Robert Francis investigated because of poor care, mortality and morbidity rates skyrocketing. And they found that the main issues patients were having was they weren't having their fundamental care done well, or at all in some cases. We have this tension in terms of the nursing profession in particular, and midwifery to some extent, that we're becoming more professionalized and require more intellectual knowledge in many ways, yet patients and consumers, they would probably claim the most important things to them are the same things that were important 30 years ago, which is that basic interaction, that communication, and that hands-on help that they need. So we need to retain that as we move into whatever the future looks like.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a really nice note for us to finish on, Tony. So just like to show my appreciation and gratitude for you joining the show. There's a lot of people right across the country who are benefiting from the information that people like yourselves are sharing in this way. We wish you all the best implementing your strategic plan, and I think maybe we'll touch base with you in a year or so and get a little update and see how it's going. But thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. Much appreciated, and have a great day.
You've been listening to Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. This podcast is produced by AusMed, one of Australia's leading providers of educational content and software to the health, aged, disability, community and allied health sectors. To find out more, head to our website, ausmed.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Outcomes, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your favourite podcasting app. And while you're there, please leave us a 5-star review, as it really helps others to find the show. I'm Will Egan, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Outcomes.